I appreciate everybody here. You know, got a medium, little bit of a turnout, probably more than I expected even. So, thanks everybody. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. So, as you know, the talk here is finally emulating the Atari Jaguar, and I don't know how many people here actually know who I am, so I'll do a little bit of an overview here. What is a rich Whitehouse? I kind of started out my career making Doom maps. You know, I was maybe like 12 years old or so. Before that, I started teaching myself C++ with, you know, those really crappy little teach yourself C++ in 21 days books, you know. And by the time Quake came out, I had a little bit of programming skills, so I started making Quake mods. That transitioned into Half-Life mods, and I made a kind of reasonably well-known at the time Quake Half-Life mod called the Jumbot, and it was a multiplayer deathmatch AI opponent for Half-Life. I think I ended up getting, I think, a few million downloads on 3D downloads, and that led to me going to Raven Software. Those guys, you know, they worked on Soldier of Fortune, the Star Wars Jedi Knight games, Star Trek Elite Force, and I believe now they're kind of doing like cleanup Call of Duty work for, you know, whichever studio Activision deems should be the main Call of Duty developer at the time, you know. Yeah, which does vary quite often. But anyway, so I approached Raven Software when I was around 16, 17 years old, and at the time I was already locked into a contract with Crytek, and nobody knew who Crytek was back then. They were working, or they had me working on a game called Engelos, I believe that's how it's pronounced, and they actually had me writing AI for it in the Quake 2 engine. And well, they were basically trying to put together an engine of their own. This was like when Crytek, yeah, obviously they became pretty well known for the CryEngine and a lot of stuff, but this is like when they were first building that foundation, they had me working on this game with them. And, you know, I'd prototype some AI, send it over. Shavat, which was their CEO, was like, okay, cool, looks good, you know, but nothing was really materializing as far as the game went. And so during, you know, while that was still going on, I went to Raven, and I'm like, hey, well, can I write a bot for Soldier of Fortune? And Soldier of Fortune was still being, you know, it was on the verge of coming out. It was like right there towards the release timeline. They're like, oh yeah, we know who you are. We played with your Half-Life stuff. So they flew me up to Madison and gave me a tour of the studio and ended up sending me back with a CD of Soldier of Fortune SDK code. And so, you know, I did that. Shortly after that, went up to Raven to work full-time salary, started working on Jedi Knight 2 multiplayer. They kind of just like threw me into the deep end on that one. By my own admission, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing at that point in my career, you know. And so, I don't want to get into, you know, burn too much time on this stuff. I know most of you guys are here for Jaguar stuff. And so, just to try to give a brief summary of this, you know, ended up being, through various internal politics and such, the sole multiplayer programmer on Jedi Knight 2, which was a bit of a surprise and a challenge for me at the time, I must say. And so, you know, that kind of is what started my career in video games. And at that time, I was working largely on like high-level video game code, stuff like that. And over time, I started transitioning into more like engine-level stuff, more technology-based stuff. Ended up going over to Human Head, working on Prey. Ended up in between there doing a lot of my own engine development. Some minigame stuff. I developed a Final Fantasy VII fan game in my own engine called Avalanche. Used the same engine to do some, you know, prototype work for a publisher called NGMoko. Published a game myself called Corporate Fury, also on iOS, using the same engine. And so that's all that's kind of the lead up of me like building my knowledge, building my technical skills. And mind you, I was, you know, the reason I started my career so early on is I was self-educated, and, you know, obviously like doing a contract with Crytek when I was 15, it was all from that like buildup of modding experience and stuff like that. So I've had a bit of a weird career path, to put it mildly. And so that finally led to me working with the Digital Eclipse guys. and being introduced to Frank Cifaldi and the Video Game History Foundation, because I really started building those low-level, assembly level, reverse engineering skills, things along that line that are really helpful in actually doing history on stuff, digging into the historical aspect of something like a prototype where, you don't have source code, but you still want to actually, either make the prototype work, maybe it's in a broken state and you want to actually get it up and running again, or you want to dig through what's in there, see what the assets are, because a lot of the time there are unused assets in a prototype like that. And the only way to do that is to, use those very low-level reverse engineering skills, which, as it turns out, are also very useful in emulation. So, but yeah, so I worked with Digital Eclipse on the Disney Classics Collection, Aladdin and Lion King, and I did something called Aladdin, the Final Cut in that. And that was actually a product kind of indirectly of me working with the Video Game History Foundation to analyze and evaluate the Sega Genesis Aladdin source code. And if you go to the gamehistory.org, go back quite a few years now in the, in the blog post, you'll find a whole, an article I wrote that is a write-up on Aladdin for the Sega Genesis, exploring the mechanics of the game, finding things that were actually cut and not used in the game, like a number of enemies were not used. One that comes to mind was like the sword swallower. He pulls swords out of his throat and chucks them at you. It's a lot of interesting unused material in that game. And so it was enough to fill an article talking about all that stuff. And I think kind of indirectly that led to some discussions, which then led to, the usual business end of things that I was not part of. But they ended up actually deciding to do that Classics collection with Aladdin and letting us do the Final Cut thing, which was really cool. And then, went on to work on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles with Digital Eclipse as well, Cowabunga collection. And did some interesting reverse engineering enhancement features for all those games and that. And finally, that led to Atari 50. And before Atari 50, let me see here. There we go. New slide. So before Atari 50, we had kind of a sit-down meeting, and we discussed the viability of a whole lot of different games that we had, licensing permissions for and stuff like that we might be able to include in the collection. And there were Jaguar games among them. And so, the discussion came up of, is it going to be viable to do a Jaguar emulator in the production timeline allotted for a collection like this? And, I chimed in and say, it's been on my bucket list to write a Jaguar emulator for quite a long time now, because I wanted an Atari Jaguar when it first came out. My parents didn't have the money for it. And so, I was lamenting to my wife one year about the fact that I never got to actually play with this library of games, and she ended up buying me an Atari Jaguar for Christmas that year. And so I got to play, some of the classics like Tempest 2000, Cybermorph, and it was a little bit cost prohibitive to buy, more software for for the platform at that point, because we're into the territory where things are going for $60, $100 on eBay, and so I looked to emulators. State of emulation was not great. I think Project Phoenix was maybe the most advanced at that time in terms of compatibility and accuracy, and I played around with it a bit. Ran into a lot of bugs, a lot of things that just broke down and couldn't progress, stuff like that. And so I kind of set it aside, and I'm like, I really want to have a shot at writing a Jaguar emulator myself someday, because I don't really want to experience these titles for the first time. In this kind of software, things are in a little bit of a broken state. And so it had been a personal desire of mine for some time. So I said, I really want to do this. But also because there aren't any, really 100% compatible solid Jaguar emulators out there, why don't we do something a little bit unusual here? And I'd like permission to continue working on this thing and, releasing public binaries after the fact, so that I can continue developing it. People can enjoy, a really solid compatible Jaguar emulator if I get it to that state, because at this point I'm not entirely confident in myself. This was my very first shot at actually writing an emulator, and I developed a skill set that I felt was, everything needed to write an emulator, but I'd never had the opportunity cost to sit down and actually do that. And so I basically said, can you give me a month to just do research, figure out, what's out there in terms of available documentation, see how far along these open source emulators actually are, see if there's anything that we can base, work on instead of starting from scratch. And so they agreed to that. It took about a week, and at the end of that week, I kind of determined, that everything that's out there in terms of open source has a lot of fundamental performance issues. There's a lot of stuff that needs to be fundamentally re-architected. And so I decided to just, bite the bullet. I'm going to write a brand new Jaguar emulator, and we're going to see where it gets at the end of the month, And happily, much to my surprise, in fact, it was, by the end of that month, capable of running Tempest 2000, pretty hardware accurately, very, as you see in Atari 50, basically. And so, that Tempest 2000, by the way, was basically the title that had to run, for Jaguar to be in this collection. That's what we decided. Tempest 2000 is the minimum viable product. And so it was very happy news that at the end of that month, it was actually already running. And basically, I continued on, and by the end of 3 months, I had the thing running the whole retail cartridge library with, no crashes, no real visible issues. And mind you, this is not a cycle-accurate emulator, so there are still timing issues. This is a pretty well-known thing, and I can get into, there's a lot of technical details there, which if anybody's interested after this, please feel free to come up to me, talk to me about it. I'll fill you in, I'll be as technical as you want. And I'll probably be hanging out at the game history exhibit after this for a while. It's D135 over there. But anyway, see here, where was I? Oh yes, so some personal stuff here. While I was writing, actually about 3 months after I'd finished the core of the emulator, this was about April of that year, I discovered that I had thyroid cancer. So this was before the first public release of Big Pimu, but kind of after I'd actually prepared that release, because obviously I wanted to give a respectable window of time in there between when Atari 50 was released and when I actually released the emulator publicly, because it was already really cool those guys to be like, yeah, you can totally go do your own thing here. I'm not gonna steal the Jaguar thunder from Atari 50, And so I discovered I had thyroid cancer. That kind of threw a wrench in the works. It did explain why I'd been in crippling pain the whole time I was I was writing this thing, and so that's kind of an interesting thing to look back and be like, yeah, I'm actually rather proud that I accomplished all this stuff while also dealing with this other stuff that I knew there was something very medically wrong, but the doctors, there was a lot of, back and forth and trying to figure out what it was, being sent to different doctors, different specialists, and it took a lot for them to finally image the necessary area and be like, oh, there is a 6-centimeter tumor growing off of your thyroid. Yeah. As my surgeon said, I wore it well because it was growing directly down into my chest plate. So you look at my neck, there's no giant bulge there or anything. But, a tumor of that size is usually, visible. So I was too stylish for that, so. Let's see here. Oh yes, and it was, also, a surprise to me to see just how well received Atari was critically. It's the 5th highest rated Switch game of 2022 on Metacritic, which is, and I don't take credit for that. I think that's largely due to the Digital Eclipse editorial team, Chris Kohler and everybody else that contribute to that. And the structure of it, I think people really loved, basically a view through history, walking through that whole timeline and being able to experience the games and media from each of those periods along the way, I think I love that approach. And I totally credit those guys for coming up with such a novel way to make it more than a game collection, make it an actual historical experience going through the Atari timeline. And so, after I'd actually released the first release of Big Pimu, which, by the way, it happened in December, because I was actually going to get my second surgery to remove the second half of my thyroid. I had some really bad complications after the first surgery, and I went to Digital Eclipse and said, hey, I'm a little bit iffy on if I'm going to make it through this second surgery, so it would be cool if I could release the emulator before I go in for this. And they're like, yeah, totally understand. They're totally cool about it. I think normally I might have waited, given a little bit more window after Atari 50, but because they were, understood the situation and were really cool about it, that's why the release happened when it did. And so I started a Patreon account when I released it publicly, and thanks to that, I don't know if anybody here is a patron. Show of hands. One person. Thank you, my friends. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And so thanks to the patron support, I've been able to actually not quite cover the full mortgage, but it's definitely been helping a lot to justify continuing to sink time into this thing. And so after release, I've accomplished a lot of additional features, and chief among them is like Jaguar CD support, attaining full compatibility with the Jaguar CD retail library. And there are some very fun and interesting titles in there if if you guys haven't experienced them. And actually, Frank at the Game History exhibit over there has a bunch of kiosks running Big Pimu. And VidGrid is one of the CD games running there. And it's certainly an interesting experience. Like, one thing that really surprises me about that one is just the fact that they managed to license like Metallica, for example. Like, what was the budget on that thing? And so after Jaguar CD support, I went after Jaguar VR support. And some of you probably know there was a Jaguar VR headset that was planned for market. It was never actually released. There are at least a couple of them, prototype hardware that I'm aware of floating out in the world. And unfortunately, I couldn't get my hands on any of them. But Missile Command 3D does actually have that head tracker implemented. And so I was able to reverse engineer basically, the protocol of the head tracker by looking at that Missile Command 3D software. And so I figured out how the head tracker is supposed to work based on what the software expects. I implemented that. And there is some debates on whether any of the Jaguar VR prototypes are actually capable of stereoscopic rendering, or whether that was at any stage of the development a planned feature. And so, of course, Missile Command 3D does not have any support for stereoscopic rendering, and I ended up implementing it in the emulator from scratch, just reverse engineering Missile Command 3D, looking at how that the rendering loop works, looking at how all the different GPU programs interact, and figuring out how I could manage to separate that into two eyes with two different camera projections without disrupting timing of gaming logic and all that. It was a hefty chunk of work, but it's in there in the emulator now, so you can actually use a modern headset, like an HTC Vive is what I've been using, but it's OpenVR, so any OpenVR compatible headset will work. And you can actually play Missile Command 3D in actual VR with proper stereoscopic rendering with head tracking on your modern headset through Big Pimu, which I'm very... Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I am very proud of that achievement. I think it's quite novel.
Thank you, Rich.
Thank you. Let's see. What's next down here? Oh, yes. And so the most recent thing that I've done is implementing multiplayer from scratch in Alien vs. Predator. Because Alien vs. Predator, as some of you may know, was a single-player game. There's no notion of multiplayer or anything. And I've kind of gone out of my way with the emulator to develop this very robust scripting system. And this scripting system has evolved into kind of a core API that more or less allows you to do anything that you could imagine with a Jaguar game. So it facilitates things like native resolution rendering, the stereoscopic support that I've implemented in Missile Command 3D, and there's a network component, which I know at least one Jaguar homebrew dev is planning on using to good effect. It's basically a really nice little interface that lets you do some brand new networking around what the Jaguar supports natively, like through JagLink, asynchronous serial interface type stuff. And you can basically just throw data at these script API functions. It's got some nice delta compression stuff going on behind the scenes, not to get too technical, sorry. But anyway, so I used this stuff to implement multiplayer in Alien vs. Predator, which basically involved reverse engineering enough of Alien vs. Predator to kind of figure out how these core game systems work, how objects are managed by the game, and how I might be able to synchronize that stuff over a network. And, you know, before I bit that off, I was kind of like, I don't know how much work I'm actually about to have to do here. And I got lucky in some respects. Alien vs. Predator is very nicely structured in terms of data. And there's now a lot of things like stray pointers going off and other stuff that you have to deal with. So you've got a few core sets of different types of data that you need to worry about synchronizing over the network. And it ended up being, I think, maybe only a few days of actual solid work to, you know, put multiplayer in Alien vs. Predator with the scripting system. And I credit, you know, the capabilities of that scripting system a lot for simplifying that, because I spent all this time building all these frameworks and APIs, and then it was like, okay, now I'm going to actually use them. And hey, things are easy now. Cool, you know? Oh yeah, and so debugger-enabled builds are also another feature that I've added, you know, post-release. That was a big one requested on the Patreon, and quite a few Jaguar developers are using it to good effect to make developing software a hell of a lot easier than it's been for the past 30 years. And so I hope we see some, you know, cool stuff come out of the homebrew community, at least partially assisted by this, and hopefully, you know, expedited by this, because I know that firsthand, debugging stuff on Jaguar hardware, not fun. No, very time consuming. And I just want to display this. This is Cybermorph running a full 1080p. Thank you. And we've even got some anti-aliasing going on the edges of these polygons. It's just, this gives me warm fuzzies to look at. I see someone in the audience taking a picture, so I'll leave the slide up long enough. All right. Thank you. Yeah, I agree. And so why did it take 30 years to get here, you know, in terms of the quality of Jaguar emulation? I think a big reason for that is, you know, many emulator authors are constantly evaluating their own opportunity cost, and they're like, okay, yeah, the Jaguar is not well emulated, but it's also a very, you know, niche system. And, you know, how much bang for buck am I going to get out of emulating this thing? And if the, you know, the opportunity hadn't come along with Atari 50, it's very possible I would have remained on my bucket list for the rest of my life. So I'm really glad that that opportunity came up to, you know, have it be commercially funded, basically, but then actually be able to continue developing it with support of the community. And, you know, I think this is also a great thing for preservation. There's been, I'm like, the agreement there basically prevents me from currently releasing the source code for it. So there's been some criticism of like, oh, well, it's not open source, it's useless for preservation. Completely disagree. It is definitely useful for preservation. And, you know, the source code is well preserved. It will be, you know, it's in the right hands to ensure that this data and knowledge that's come out of this will be used, you know, by future generations, however many generations ahead that is, I don't know. That part's not in my hands, but it'll be there, you know. So yeah, that's this is just a great thing, that a commercial opportunity. And trust me, I'm personally quite anti-capitalist, so I'm not going to go around just praising commercial practices. But I think it's great that this opportunity actually allowed me to make this emulator and continue development of it through support of the patrons. And the other issue, I think, is just that the Jaguar is a very technically complicated machine, especially for the era, because it was very unusual for a manufacturer to go out of their way to develop brand new silicon. For example, for those two RISC chips, you've got just a brand new architecture, pretty much unheard of back then. Obviously you did have some custom hardware, different types of IC type stuff. Like if you look at a Super Nintendo, for example, it's got a common CPU, but it's also got a lot of custom work for the PPU, the APU, stuff like that. So that was not uncommon, but it was uncommon to have, a brand new CPU, complete architecture manufactured specifically for a console. And the documentation that Atari, gave to developers, as I discovered, was both incomplete and quite inaccurate. So, yeah, that meant that I had to, and thankfully by the time I started this, the Jaguar game drive was available. That's basically a flash card for the Jaguar, and that made my job a whole lot easier, because I was able to, in addition to looking at things at the actual hardware level, I was able to write software tests, run it on the game drive, see exactly what the answers I was getting back from hardware, and that allowed me to identify a lot of inaccuracies in the documentation a lot more quickly than I otherwise would have been able to. So, thank you, Jaguar Game Drive. So I think that the fact that timing is such an important thing on the Jaguar is also a unique intersection with the whole parallel processing paradigm, because obviously these days we have things like all the way from the PS3 to current generation parallel processing got a lot more popular, a lot more common. But with that, we had actual operating systems running on these things. Even when a game's running, the operating system's running, the operating system's determining threading priorities and scheduling. And so that means that running a game on one of those things is already non-deterministic. Whereas Jaguar games, not everything was completely deterministic. Like you turn on that machine, you might have different bits in RAM each time, for example. But the timing of the actual hardware was deterministic. There was no operating system running under there. You run the thing, you get what you get. And that had some downsides in terms of developers were writing bugs into their software, and those bugs just happened to never get hit upon because hardware timing was so very reliable. And so you come along, you write an emulator that is not cycle accurate, you are going to run into a whole lot of timing bugs. And so a lot of the work in Big PMU was being able to, without necessarily being totally cycle accurate, for example, like emulating bus priorities accurately, which that's a whole different talk, getting into why that's easy in FPGA-based emulation versus why it's super hard in software emulation, because it's very cost prohibitive from a native cycle standpoint, jumping around between a whole lot of different components that are trying to access the bus at the same time. And basically every time you go to do a memory access, you've got to interrupt your emulation timeline, and so on and so forth. Again, not to get too much into the technical weeds here. But yeah, so identifying that stuff and making timing good enough to be able to avoid it, like making sure the pipeline emulation was actually working correctly, timing was faithful to hardware, even if memory accesses and bus emulation weren't. I got to discover a whole lot of different, timing problems in different games. And my favorite one, the most horrifying one, I should say, was in Missile Command 3D, because we had an issue, and Missile Command 3D was an Atari 50, mind you, so this was something I had to actually solve for, in the production schedule. There was a bug where if you just let it soak and load into the first demo level, it would crash. And so I started looking at that, and what I actually did was I developed a complete framework to basically encapsulate Missile Command 3D inside another ROM, and my ROM was basically controlling Missile Command 3D GPU code. So I took an emulator save state right before this crash was happening. I put it in there on the flash cart along with my test framework and the Missile Command 3D ROM. I loaded the hardware into the exact state that the emulator was in before the crash, using all that data. Then I used the 68K to basically single step the GPU code because the retail silicon luckily has some kind of debuggery functionality still in there that allows you to basically put the RISC chips into single step mode and just go instruction by instruction. So I'm sitting here pushing the button on my Jaguar controller, watching, one instruction at a time go by, and as soon as I get to the place where it crashes in the emulator, it crashes on hardware because it's a quantum bug. It only doesn't crash when it's not being watched, And the reason for that turned out to be there was a very delicate balance of stuff going on. The blitter was trying to access the bus, the object processor was trying to access the bus, DSP, 68K, GPU, all at the same time. And that, conglomeration of components, the timing of it was disrupted when I was actually single-stepping through and trying to replicate that crash on hardware in a way that I could understand. And it turned out being a really, really awful right after right hazard. And right after right hazards are quite unique to these particular RISC chips in the Jaguar. I can't even think of another RISC chip that actually allows right after right hazards because typically there's a bookkeeping system that prevents that sort of thing. And right after right basically means you load into a register, you do some other stuff, you write into that same register, but the load took longer than all those operations in between. So the register is actually going to contain the result of that load after something else wrote into it. So you get, it's a little bit mind-boggling if you're not used to that paradigm. It's like time events, time is out of order, time has become nonlinear, oh my God, So yeah, I think that mostly covers, the general why the Jaguar has been really hard to emulate. And it's taken a lot of time and dedication and understanding, deep understanding of how these things work to get it to a state where it can run everything. And that's been a huge investment of time, of course. So again, that comes back to thank you, Atari, for presenting that opportunity. And they have unique challenges and benefits in software emulation there. It basically refers to what I kind of went over. If you're taking an FPGA-based approach, for example, it's actually quite trivial to emulate, those different bus contentions and bus priorities because you just replicate that hardware. It's doing, functioning the same way. Whereas on software, I kind of mentioned if you do that, very cost prohibitive to basically have to re-enter into all those different components on like maybe 2 to 3 cycle time slices, Oops, screensaver. All right. And yeah, that about covers it for the presentation. So again, thank you to my one patron over there. Much appreciated, sir. And yeah, please do. The rest of you, if you do find this work worthwhile, I'm going to be continuing to do more work on Jaguar emulation. I'm hoping to get into actually emulating other systems, trying to fill in some of the other gaps in emulation. Kind of got my eye on like the 3DO, the Saturn. Yeah. And so yeah, there's a lot of stuff that I would like to get into, and patron support to help me justify that time investment would really help. So anybody who can, spread the word, my friends. Do it. Appreciate it. And yeah, I did not provide any actual material to show off Alien versus Predator multiplayer because I was doing this on a bit of a tight timeline. But do check it out. Go to richwhitehouse.com/Jaguar. You can download Big Pimu yourself. You can play around with all these features, and it's easy to find out how to contact me online and ask whatever you want. But you're also free to ask me whatever you want right now. So let's do a little bit of a Q&A. Yeah.
Yeah, how is, the personal question, how is your, medical struggle, how has it, affected your ability to support yourself?
Yeah, I appreciate you, caring. The question was, how is my medical situation right now, and how has it affected my ability to support myself? And to be honest, it's been a real struggle. I'm still suffering with a lot of symptoms. I got some fairly bad news actually the day before I flew out here in terms of thyroglobulin going back up, which tends to mean more thyroid activity, which means I get to be radiated again, which means my salivary glands are going to be permanently damaged again, which don't want to get the room too down there. But but yeah, it's been a struggle, and the Patreon income has actually helped a great deal to supplement kind of what I've been able to get for contracts this year. And honestly, there's something weird going on in the video game industry. I'm talking to a lot of people that are having a lot of trouble booking stuff for 2024. I actually had the head of another studio come to me and ask, hey, do you know of any B2B, business-to-business opportunities? And I thought he was talking about my studio, and I'm like, yeah, I'm available for contracting. He's like, oh no, sorry, I'm looking for work. They're like, well, I feel your pain, buddy. So yeah, it's dry out there for some reason.
But do you have a email, like a PayPal we can support you at if we don't do Patreon?
Yeah, if you go to my website, richwhitehouse.com, and click the About tab, there's a PayPal link in there as well. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
So you mentioned one of your initial goals from the emulator was to release public builds after Atari 50. Were there any obstacles or challenges with letting digital Eclipse basically let you release their intellectual property?
Surprisingly not, and I would credit that largely to Mike Micah, because Mike Micah is a man that has real passion for this kind of thing and a real understanding. And so when I mentioned to him, he was immediately like, that is a fantastic idea. We're going to figure out how to make this happen. And so, yeah, totally thanks to, Mike Micah, I think, is a big part of the culture of Digital Eclipse and why they're, producing these top-tier collections. So I really, I value my friendship with him. We actually met back in 2010 when I was doing mobile gaming stuff, and really great guy. You first.
So you mentioned how before Atari 50 you had the Jaguar on your bucket list of working on an emulator for it. Are there any other consoles that are also currently on your bucket list that you would like to work on eventually if you have the time?
Yeah, so 3DO and Saturn are up there. I know that Saturn has actually made some fairly recent strides in quality of accuracy of emulation, and so I don't know exactly how much help that one needs at this point, but nonetheless it has been on my bucket list. So, but yeah, I'm actually pretty open to suggestions if anybody has a piece of hardware is in desperate need of attention and love, and I know Nuon's been up there. People have come to me about the Nuon, and I've said, yeah, I'm definitely open to it. I know there's an existing emulator called Nuance that is in a questionable state, I think. I haven't checked it out myself, but it's got, a lot of bugs and performance problems and stuff like that. So if I could ever justify that opportunity cost, I would definitely be open to doing that one as well.
That'd be great.
What does the big P mean? A big P-moo? What is
It is a large pussycat emulator, so big pussycat emulator. Because to me, the Jaguar is an adorable, lovable pussycat.
Hi. So, you mentioned FPGA versus software earlier, and I understand you probably want to continue supporting Big PMU as the software emulator. Do you see yourself working with anyone to create a, say, Mr. Core even?
Yeah, I know that actually, very shortly after Big PMU was announced, Joe Tago, who's a big, Mr. Core developer, created a repository for a Jaguar core, and I don't think I've seen a single submission in there since, but the repository exists, so it reflected some interest, I guess. And I noticed Joe Tago actually liked one of my Big PMU posts on Twitter some time ago, so he's around there, he's looking, he's paying attention. He hasn't reached out to me, But, I think personally, for me to do any meaningful FPGA development, it would require some ramping up because I've just never dabbled in that area. I think it could be fun to do, so I'm open to it. But nobody has actually reached out to me from that community to be like, hey, we're having a hard time figuring out this hardware component. Can you give us more info about it? But if they did, I'd be very happy to, help them. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Was there anything undocumented that you had to solve on your own about the hardware?
Yeah, a crap load of things. So one of the first things that comes to mind was there was a particular instruction meant for extracting floating point bits on the Jaguar, which is a bit interesting because there's no actual floating point hardware on the Jaguar, but there are RISC instructions custom tailored to dealing with floating point data, extracting it and converting it into different forms that are usable for fixed point multiplications and things like that. And the way the hardware said one of those bit extraction functions, or the way the docs, said one of those bit extraction functions operated was completely wrong. And so I had to, reverse engineer that one entirely by looking at the hardware and observing. So that there are quite a few things like that. I'd say measuring in the hundreds. So, yeah.
So building off of that, in terms of troubleshooting all the inaccuracies and what have you, was a majority of the issues, if not all of them, just fixed by yourself, or did you have to contact an older Atari developer to help you out?
Yeah, unfortunately, it was all me. I did not have access to any of the hardware developers or any documentation that wasn't public already, for that matter. So it was a trudge. Yeah. Yeah.
Question about the scripting language stuff for multiplayer and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Have you heard anything yet about anyone working on something for, say, implementing rollback netcode to get online multiplayer for Kazumi Ninja, for example?
I have already implemented that. Yeah, rollback network support is in the current build of Big Pimu, and you can totally, have some world championship matches for Kasumi Ninja or Ultra Vortec or Fight for Life, for that matter.
Wow.
Yeah, so totally get those tournaments going. I'd love to see it.
Any chance for a native Linux version and an ARM64 version?
Yep, that is on the agenda. And so that, I'm whittling down the priority list. I'm doing all this crazy stuff with the scripting language. And it's kind of a balance at this point. If I think of something like, oh man, I really got to do that with the scripting system, I'm going to jump off and do it. But Linux is otherwise currently, the main remaining priority, I think, in addition to working towards cycle accuracy. And I've got some developers nagging me about, oh, hey, this bug that I created doesn't occur in Big Pimu, but it occurs on hardware, and they get frustrated by that. And I'm like, well, the actual time investment to achieve cycle accuracy in software is probably another 3 months of solid full-time labor at least. And so I don't know if I can quite justify that time investment yet, but it's I've got those different priorities. But yeah, Linux is pretty up there at this point.
Maybe you already explained it and I missed it, but I'm curious why it isn't open source, the project.
Yeah, I did mention that, and it ties into contractual obligations with the companies that own this thing. And it's kind of up to them, if and when they decide to release it into public domain or whatever. But also, personally, I've ensured that source code will remain safe and preserved long after my death. So it'll be there at some point,
Yeah, when it comes to Atari 50, was there a specific selection process with which Jaguar games that you prioritize? I know you said Tempest 2000, but
yeah.
Why Fight for Life? Why,
I think it basically came down to whatever we could get cleared on licensing. Okay. Yeah, because once the emulator got to the point of I can pretty much run anything, it was all about we just got to work through licensing for these different titles.
Number 2, where do you see the future of the Atari Jaguar platform with all the scripting you're doing? What do you dream of being capable on the Jaguar, both in emulation and in terms of interaction between emulation and real hardware?
Yeah, so I was just talking to a developer recently and telling them that the scripting system basically gives them as little or as much Jaguar as they want. So if you wanted, for example, you could totally just write your entire game in C in the scripting system, maybe have like the Jaguar object processor just rendering your frame buffer for you, and that, you know, that could be the extent of Jaguar involvement. Or you could pull it back further, maybe use Sublitter for stuff, pull it back further, use maybe just the GPU for stuff. And so there's a whole lot of flexibility there in terms of like what becomes possible if you're willing to write software specifically for the emulator. And there, you know, there's a lot of resistance in the community. It's kind of split between people who are like, I don't care if it doesn't work on hardware, I want nothing to do with it. And people who are really excited to have these new capabilities, and they want to take their Jaguar software and enhance them in like new and interesting ways. And I do have at least one homebrew developer who is like very, very interested, very excited. He's using the native hardware rendering for his own game. He wants to use the networking system to implement new multiplayer for his game. So that kind of stuff is really great to see, and I hope to see, you know, more developers kind of jump onto that bandwagon. But Jaguar developers are, you know, a bit of cats to herd. So yeah, back there.
So since you had to reverse engineer so much of the existing Jaguar.
Are we running? Oh yeah, I think we're about out of time here, but yeah, sorry I finished up there.
Yeah, so what do you think the life of like a commercial Jaguar software developer was like?
The life of a software developer?
I mean, it's like, was it particularly terrible since you got no documentation?
I think, yeah, it was pretty hard for them back then when they were like, you know, on the cutting edge, not just working with what they had, just kind of winging it. So, you know, I feel for those guys. But yeah, I guess we'll wrap up here. And if anybody wants to talk to me some more, got any more questions, you feel free to come see me over at the Game History Place. So I'll be sitting in the center table for a bit. And thank you all very much for coming. I really appreciate it.
Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and to the right are a few more videos from the Portland Retro Gaming Expo 2023. Thanks for watching.